He's definitely brutal. He's always savage, and you're definitely getting wrecked.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and this one is going to be with Artosis, who technically was not in the Reflection series because he is so old school. He was in Grilled, which was actually the series that I did, which is basically Reflections, but it was when I used to work with Team Acer, if you remember. Now, what people won't know about that, Artosis, is actually, between the two of us, you look quite similar, mate. Back then, I used to have like the crazy hair. I was never on camera, if people don't know, so I had zero fucking appearance, look, none of it. I was just a nerd journalist back then who was just doing all the research. I wasn't from StarCraft, for people don't know, so it wasn't my native game. I had to really dive in there. Like, I've read every bloody page of Team Liquid back in the day and all the match threads and stuff. Like, it was a pretty mad approach. But anyway, so this is one of those interviews, if people don't know, where we could have done it many, many, many times in the past. But if you know how it is, especially when people are in different time zones, you don't get it done this time, you try next time, you tag and you keep going back. But here's the thing about me. I'm like the old school bounty hunters, mate. I always get my man in the end. I'm just the guy where I might not know where you've gone on the frontier, but I'll just keep going town to town. Is he here? Is anyone around here? What's going on? Anyone who's biased towards Thorin? And then eventually I find you, and we've done it. So now we're going to do it. So it might be something mad. Like, if I had to guess, I think it might actually be like 10 years since the last interview. So there's a lot to catch up on. And amazingly, this is one thing I've actually found very interesting myself, because I tuned out a little bit on StarCraft the last few years. StarCraft 2 is still going, guys. And in fact, I was looking this up. Dude, the prize money's insane. Like, I actually thought for real it'd be one of those games where it's like around the time the mainstream left, like, oh, there'll be no... You'll find out later in this interview, guys, but like, it very much is an alive game, and the history just continued. Like, it actually, funnily enough, it now takes its place in the pantheon with Brood War, with Counter-Strike, with the games that have had like the 10 Street Fighter, those 10 plus years where they become like the iconic games. It wasn't what people thought, the flash in the pan and like it's a dead game. Like, it's actually more alive now, technically, in terms of prize money than it ever was in the past. So let's start out at the beginning, Artosis. So even though we did a lot of the old stuff in the first interview, I just want to briefly revisit some earlier points in your career to get the later perspective. Obviously, you're much older now. You have your family life. You can look back on those times differently. So the one thing I want to start with is this. I always think people, even in the StarCraft 2 era, actually didn't understand your career because they knew like you were a player a bit. But then the part they always got wrong is, I think they genuinely just think you're in the Tasteless origin story to Korea, that it was like the two of you, and they think it's like GSL. They think you were always casting and you must have been doing like, you know, it was GOM back then as well, but it's the GOM class. They don't know you weren't doing that. You were actually still just a fan like the rest of us in the West, and you kind of just, that was the period you were able to transition into being a broadcast talent. So now obviously it is one of the most iconic, if not iconic, casting duos of all time. Now you are just the firm fixture in StarCraft. Do you ever look back, and was there a world where, did you ever zig at the right time? Could it have gone different? Would you have ever stayed as a pro player? Do you ever wish you'd gone fully pro? Was it always going to be some kind of transition to commentary?
Well, no, actually, it's kind of the opposite. Like, when I moved out to Korea, like, I got out there to do commentary specifically. And I actually wanted to be a pro. Like, I was pro as far as the US scene went. I've represented America like multiple times in Brood War and everything. And I started commentating, and that was kind of like my in to get to Korea, because this website, it was basically the guys that are now SPO TV. They were IEG, they owned eStro and things like that. They were trying to prepare for StarCraft 2. So they made a website called SC for All. And because I was becoming quite a popular commentator in the English-speaking scene, they contacted me. They're like, hey, we'd like you to do some commentary for this website. And it kind of made a light bulb go off in my head. And I was like, yeah, I can do that, but I need to come to Korea to do it. Because they originally just wanted me to do it online and send it in. And they're like, okay, we'll give you a little trial period. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to use this to turn into a pro gamer. I'm going to go and get to join
that was the back door to get in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's the funny thing. Like, I moved over, and unfortunately, like, things didn't go quite right. I didn't have any PC to practice on or anything. I was working a lot. I was at an office. You know, I was doing a lot of commentary for Pro League and MSL at the time, doing interview videos and house tours and things like this, just anything I could do to kind of stay afloat. But the entire time, my focus was like, I want to play professionally in Korea. And then even when StarCraft 2 came out, I quit working for them before I had GSL at all. I didn't even know GSL was coming at the time. Basically, the beta came out, and I'm like, I got to take this full time. And I mean, in StarCraft 2, at the very beginning, I was playing the pro tournaments and things. But then GSL came along and I was so broke that I became a commentator there. And the thing is, this is the way that life kind of brought me through. And I would say, like, if for my skill set, it probably fits me a lot better. But like, it was never like I wanted to be a commentator. I love being a commentator. It's the best job in the entire world. But it just kind of happened while I've tried to be a pro gamer the entire time.
One thing, like a detail a lot of fans won't understand is, even at the time you're talking about moving over, no one could ever know that there would be a real career where you could make legit money doing English language streams of a Korean broadcast. Like at the time, if people don't know, there was no English broadcast for OGN and NBC game. Like I was watching those VODs with, like, I won't say the names, but some pretty bad commentators in the West who were just in their bedroom, just casting the game. And I didn't know, because I was a noob, that like they didn't know any of the builds. They didn't know what we were talking about. Like it was very, very amateur. And so even when they did the GOM stuff, that was, if people don't know, like a third tournament in the circuit, and it was trying to break through, but it was at the transition point. And obviously, like Blizzard awarded like the StarCraft 2 stuff to the GOM people. People will know there was the whole drama with the lawsuit, and was OGN going to join, and Kesper and all that. So actually, when you initially went there as well, no one could really know how long is this commentary thing going to last, right? And you definitely couldn't know we could be like the #1 duo in commentary in the whole world of esports, right?
Yeah, that stuff didn't really exist back then. I mean, there was English commentary. A lot of it was very, very bad around the world. Really, when you look at it, it was like very generic casters that weren't really good. They weren't really experts and stuff. And occasionally you had some good people, you know, poking their heads out and doing some commentary. But yeah, it wasn't like a long-term career thing. It was, you know, you were just trying to scratch gigs together a little bit to make just enough money to live, and try to figure out the next thing to just kind of stay in the industry as long as possible at that point. Definitely there was no premeditated plan or anything. It really, as far as really taking commentary seriously, I didn't until I was working for GSL. That's when I'm like, oh, there is actually, like, I'm making enough money now and there's enough things popping up that this is like realistically something I can do for a long time and actually live off of comfortably.
Obviously, since you are part of this iconic duo with Tasteless, right? The funny thing, and as well people won't understand, is in Brood War, because Tasteless went out there pretty much by himself. I mean, it was by himself. If people don't know, little Susie, now Monty's wife, and obviously worked many other roles in esports, she even sometimes was like hopping in the booth to be another commentator. Yeah. So it wasn't just Tasteless, right. And she was the interviewer, if people don't know. So back then, he was just considered an all-round talent. At the time, let's be real, most esports games were play-by-play only. There wasn't really like a colour commentary role like sports. It was like maybe if a pro's available, you get them to jump in and say what the builds are or whatever. So actually, when you came along, I would say to me, you are the iconic colour commentator in esports history. And so when you've set up this particular duo in this way, right, there's a big difference. I had to learn this myself, and a lot of pros do, right? There's a phenomenon I like to describe, which is when a pro tries commentary for the first time, everyone automatically just goes, "You're really good at it. Oh, you're awesome," because you just listen to the new voice, you know, and maybe you like a couple of like new angles he has. But the pro very quickly has to learn, like, having knowledge about the game is very different from commentating. Like, there's a whole skill set, there's technicals. Like, put it this way, as an aside, I found this out recently in my own game of CSGO when I've been doing some stuff for my sponsor, which is a betting sponsor. Because what I had to learn was, it isn't even about knowing about the game, it's about understanding how betting metagame works, like when to bet, when not to, like what the goods odds, what, like it's not just knowing who's going to win the game, you have to price it in and all. There's a lot of like math, actually, believe it or not, which is not really my strong suit, but I learned this. So what I had to learn was, each of these jobs is its own skill set, it's its own world, and you have to really, there's the other thing, you have to commit. The pro that does it for one tournament gets those plaudits. You might think he could be the best commentator, you would never beat Artosis. Like, he's got decades on you, mate. He's super deep on those, and you know all the technical skills, right? How much have you dedicated yourself to that? Because obviously you've done it a long, long time now.
Yeah. If I look back at how I started commentary, right, like the first couple of tournaments that I commentated were something I made with Gentho, the old War 3 pro, called Ascension, which actually helped me
the
get
infamous project.
Yeah. Never got that final
exactly,
together, man.
The original one.
And then, of course, the first TSL.
Yes.
And really, if I look back at what the commentary was, like, I was one of the top non-Korean players, and I just was excited about the game. Like, everyone has always known I kind of like love the game more than pretty much everybody. So the combination of knowing what was going on and then being excited about it was the entirety of my commentary, and people loved it. So that like helped me to get, you know, a lot of people like liking the cast and get a lot of people following it and kind of cheering me on and helping me to get hired into things. But certainly if you look back, it's like, oh God, I was so bad compared to now. And like, definitely a ton of work went into becoming a strong like broadcaster specifically. Like Tasteless and I have spent so much time, especially back in the beginning. Like nowadays, it's not as much because we have so much experience that like we can literally exchange 2 or 3 words in the middle of a cast or at the end of a cast, and like, you know, rejigger everything into the right position where it's like, oh, this is what went wrong, this is what went right, you know, and get that done very quickly. But we spent tons of time like discussing the ins and outs of the commentary, like the way that we handle certain things, the way that we pass things back and forth, how to communicate during a cast, you know, how much talking time is actually really good per person, things like that. So there was like a lot of that in the beginning for a very long time before we kind of got into the groove where we, you know, I don't know if I want to say like mastered commentary, but got good enough at it that it wasn't like a completely active pursuit, like working on it every day, if that makes sense.
I think that's one thing about your commentary as well. Again, a fan might naively think it's just knowing the game and the builds and this sort of... I wouldn't say it's just game knowledge. Like, you described it very well there. I think your passion for StarCraft easily jumps through the camera. I actually think if you think of some of the great commentators in other games, that's one of the main qualities that draws me in. Like, I can tell when you're doing the commentary that, like, you are the guy where you would watch you'd probably watch the game still if you didn't get paid to do it, you know. There's not a lot of people would. Yeah. There's a lot of people I've also known where they thought this was their dream job, but that was a fantasy. They did it a few years and they found out it's really hard, or you know what, you get burned out, or you're not as interested in this patch or whatever. Like, I'll even say the element I always thought was misunderstood about your commentary and your love for the game is maybe because you were friends with IdrA, but a lot of people tried to paint you as like some too cynical, or you just complain. Even that comes from passion, guys. What happens is he wants to see the game played at its highest level. He doesn't want to see cheesy players or silly lock moments. You want to see the best players that exhibit the skill. So yeah, talk a little bit about that, because what is it about StarCraft that keeps you going? Like, now we're talking about many years later and you're still very much going in the game.
Yeah. I mean, it, like, for instance, this morning, right? Like right now I have no, I guess, professional commentary gigs. We're still doing ASL online and everything. But like, I mean, I was playing StarCraft this morning before we did this interview. Like, it's what I do. It's what I love. It's what I've always loved. I've played StarCraft for 24 years now. And I mean, StarCraft 2, obviously I've played a ton of that as well. And I would watch it and play it even if this wasn't my job. It's just, this is my passion. This is like, you know, I hear all these interviews that people say like, oh, follow your passion and everything. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. Like when people ask me about that, I don't know if I can give exactly that. It's more of like, I have to do this because I'm going to do it anyways.
You're compelled.
Like, I can't not do it. I love StarCraft so much. It's just, you know, I've spent so much time on it. It's, you know, people are like, oh, have you done like the 10,000 hours on it? It's like, no. I'm like at 40,000 hours. Okay. It's crazy how much time I put in. Like, it doesn't even, it's like all of my time for over 20 years. So it's just, the game is so beautiful. There is such a skill ceiling to it. Like, it's so infinite. You can improve in every direction forever. And it's just like to watch that all come together with how deep it is strategically, how hard it is to do everything mechanically. I'm getting chills talking about it because it's like, it still excites me this day. Every day I'm excited to play. Every day I'm excited to watch the best players play because the game is just, it's got this infinite depth that just makes it never, ever, ever get old.
One thing that I actually would love to ask you about as well is, in Brood War, the explanation we all used to give as to why that was is because it was one of the games, much like my native Counter-Strike, that wasn't really patched much. It was just kept basically the same. I mean, people don't know. I think the last patch in Brood War was something like 2000 or something. It was really, really early on. So it did like a decade with no patches. But famously, because like you're describing here, it was a very like open, creative environment where you could do all sorts of things. There's even the meta game would obviously alternate what was popular and what wasn't. They used to use the map as a way to balance it. So people know these angles, right? This narrative's already been built up. But that's what I want to ask about with StarCraft 2, because in StarCraft 2, what I actually think made a lot of people scared that the game would die off or become killed or not interesting was that the patches could be so radically different. And obviously the expansions, I mean, people saw like they threw like Zerg down to Protoss up to, I mean, Terran was always good, but you know what I mean? Like these could be really, so what do you think it is in StarCraft 2? Because it seems like it must have been a different set of like concepts that have kept it enduring as a game, right? It wasn't just that it was this static environment.
Yeah. StarCraft 2 is definitely really different from StarCraft 1. I think that it requires patches a little bit more for sure. Like, if it had never gotten a patch, like you said, the Brood War last patch was like the year 2000. So now we're like 22 years in without a patch, and it's still every race wins championships. In StarCraft 2, I don't think that would be the case. It definitely needs patches occasionally, but it doesn't need that many. Like, we still have pretty good diversity in tournaments. Like, every race goes very deep. Some of the races win more than others for sure, which can be a little bit of an issue, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, it also has this unbelievably high skill ceiling. So you can just always be getting better and always kind of refine things and re-optimize and use different mind games and everything. And the game is so fast paced that if you just multitask a bit better than your opponent, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I would say that it's really similar to Brood War in those ways, but maybe I think it gets optimized a little bit quicker, because if you look at like Brood War, the amount of time that the mechanics take, the macro management, the production of workers, sending the workers to mine, the non-multiple building selection where you have to actually select every building to build everything. When you look at those, that takes up enough of your time that it can never be perfect. So there's a lot more balancing to do on what you want, which makes the skill ceiling a little bit like higher, a little bit more infinite, if that makes sense.
Requires a bit more bandwidth, right?
Yeah. So like, you can't really get games that look perfect in Brood War. It's like very rare, and it has to be like a very specific situation and very quick game, because stuff is just always going to be going wrong because you just can't do everything. But I think because in StarCraft 2 you get there a little bit quicker, where it's like, okay, all the top players kind of macro about this well, and because of the multiple building selection, you can like macro without switching your screen back and things like that. That forces the cycling of power to go like a little bit more quickly, where you might need a patch more often because things are going to get drilled down maybe a bit more quickly as people optimize really well.
Right, obviously, people are going to know with my style, I do ask some of the questions maybe other people don't. So I have one here that's about Tasteless, who, by the way, I have a great amount of affection for. I think he's a brilliant commentator, one of the best personalities, which you can already tell if I'm setting up like that, it's going to be a little bit spicy. So the question goes like this. And you know what? I think if I phrased it right, even he wouldn't mind this. Basically, as far as I can tell, because I do remember the Tasteless that first went to Korea in Brood War and was living and dying in StarCraft Brood War, and he himself was like, he would have done it for like, a packet of peanuts and somewhere to sleep for the night. Like, he really was a guy that wasn't about like money and fame and stuff. That stuff came later, by the way, justifiably so. He put in his hard yards and he really earned that career. But the perception was, and I'll say this is a perception in the industry as well as some people thought, some of it maybe came through on camera, he himself, like I said, was the one-man casting. He didn't need a duo. He just did the whole thing himself. He was the colour commentator, which is brilliant at. He knew the game. And he was obviously the voice. He had a voice that was very different back then, before whatever changed his voice. I don't know. Whiskey. Who the fuck knows? I'm not an expert on that one. But something changed his voice. Look, by the way, got one of the best fucking smoky voices of all time now, I will say. So he even locked out in that sense. But when he came to StarCraft 2, the perception was maybe he wasn't in love with StarCraft 2 as much as you are. Maybe he wasn't the guy who wanted to be in every demo watching all the Korean lad. That's why I always thought, because he had you, he maybe became more of the entertainer, and he maybe did make his voice the main thing in the car. Without being rude here, obviously I'm sure he did his research over the years, and as you say, he worked on the duo. How would you explain this side of it? Like, was Tasteless different in StarCraft 2 from Tasteless in Brood War?
Yeah, I think he was. And I mean, I think I was a little bit as well. I played StarCraft 2 a bit more than him. Like, he played a real lot in the early years, but as we got deeper into StarCraft 2, both of us stopped playing quite as much. Like, it's just like kind of all encompassing for my life, StarCraft is. So I still always play games that I'm casting quite a bit. But with Tasteless, like, I think we just were focusing so heavily on the commentary aspect that it's like, if you look at him going to Korea for Brood War, it's like, okay, he's played Brood War nonstop for 8 years or something when he went over to Korea. And like, that has been his life for 8 years. So it's like, he's played all the time. He knows everything about it. And now suddenly there's a job. Whereas from day one, basically in StarCraft 2, or, after the beta, at least, as the game is being released, it's our profession. It's our job. So it's definitely like a different start there without the wind up of playing for years and years and years and figuring everything out. So when there's a heavier focus, I guess, on the commentary, then I think that's kind of how that comes through, where it's just not Yeah, there's not that kind of build up period. And I mean, I know for sure that he does like Brood War more than StarCraft 2, but he really likes StarCraft 2 as well. So we've definitely seen that, those things like posted about him and said about him in the past. And it's like, well, I mean, I guess so, but like even with me, like I do like Brood War a bit better than StarCraft 2. I love both of them. I watch both, I commentate both, but at the end of the day, everyone has their preference, I guess, as far as game.
We're obviously going to get into like talking about when everything blew up and you were all getting first class flights and going to these mega events and doing all the big Western events and the European events and the Korean event all around the world, Biskies. But one thing I want to ask was tying into that then, because as you said, it was something that people would even comment on publicly. Was some of that, could we describe some of that? Was some of that like bitterness or people trying to sort of like, I mean, people know like as in media figures, it is a classic trend that people like to build you up and root for you when the underdog. And then when you're the top dog, they sort of want to hit on you and see your downfall or say, you washed or you just, the money got to you, change, all the lines that people would say in a movie. Do you think some of that surrounded you guys when you became the marquee casters?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, that definitely happened. And it still rotates in occasionally. Like StarCraft has shrunk a little bit. It's definitely not as big as it was, so there's not as much of it nowadays. But yeah, I mean, when we were on top of the world as far as esports personalities went, there was definitely like the cycles of haters coming in and trying to rip us down and things. And that's always part of it. I think once you hit a certain level of success, there are people that want to talk shit, want to, just make that look worse than it is and things like that.
Right. When you guys did get to the top level, as I alluded to, you were, I don't know how much you know yourself, but you were the game changers in commentary. Before that, I remember what commentators were like in big Western tournaments, the weekend tournaments, as we used to call them. They were guys who didn't even know if they were getting hired for that gig. They'd usually get asked like 2 weeks before, are you free to come to this event? Back then, sometimes they didn't even negotiate the rate. They were like, we pay €500 for the event. And you were like, brilliant. Like I was doing off for nothing before and people just accepted. Whereas the thing I remember, and this had a big impact in the industry about you guys, was you guys were able to actually leverage the fact that you were this big power duo. You weren't going to get split apart. There's the other thing. Even great commentators used to often get mixed and matched. One agrees to do the event. The other one says, no, this one charges too much. It was very easy to divide people. So this had a big impact. Like you could essentially ask for a better class of flight, or you could say, I want my own hotel room back in the day when they used to make everyone bunk together, or we'll bunk with a player or something. Or you could say things like, if we do this event, we do the final. Like you could kind of make demands finally, right? Instead of just being a guy happy to be there, right?
Yeah. That's actually, we were really lucky that we had like this great mentor character out in South Korea that helped us out with this. Like, when we first were talking to GOM TV about GSL, we made like we were like so stupid, man. God, it was so funny because like we're both like these really poor kids living out in Korea, and then like this offer of GSL comes along. So Tasteless and I go down and meet them, and it was like we had this idea that we thought was brilliant, where it's like, well, hold on, they want to pay us like $250 a cast. But what if we solo casted, and then each of us could work half as much and still make like now $500. So we had this terrible idea. And so we pitched that to them during this first meeting about the event. And they were like, I guess we'll think about it. And so then we left and we talked to this guy that was very much a mentor for us early on. His name was Jason Lee. He did a little bit of commentary filling in for various esports back in the day. Worked for Arirang TV and did some Warcraft 3 with Tasteless. But yeah, he's like a famous voice actor out in Korea, basically, like a really nice Canadian Korean guy. But yeah, he basically told us that we are the dumbest idiots that have ever existed. We needed to go back right away and talk to them and be like, no, we'll do it together. And like, he basically told us about building a brand together and like what we needed to do. So he gave us the blueprint, which is really, really important because apparently they had already kind of started reaching out to other commentators to possibly do it, like HD and Husky. And when we finally went back to them and we're like, no, we want to do it together. Sorry, that was like not the right idea. We actually got a pay cut from what they had offered. So we were only making $200 a day at that point. So it was a costly lesson, but that kind of helped us to get in the right mindset, I would say, about working together and building a brand together. Because we very, very quickly decided that, and we did for years and years, we would not be hired alone for a gig. We would not talk alone. We negotiated together. We worked together. We were a package. And that was a really powerful, important thing that we did, I think, so that it just kind of like built us together and helped us to get like maximum exposure together as a duo and maximum, I guess, practice together. So yeah, that was like a very important part of our careers, I think, early on. It's not quite like that anymore nowadays. You know, we've gone in slightly different directions with our lives. So like, we're okay if one of us wants to do a gig and the other doesn't. That happens now. We have different games that we may like or not like. So yeah, we're more flexible now, but certainly back in the day, that was like a big part of it for us.
I mean, the key thing, which if the Jason Lee guy's the one who gave you the suggestion, he in many ways, look, you should tithe him like 10% of the earnings or something. Because the thing he killed it with was the crucial thing, like you say, is the leverage. When you're the duo and you're the number one duo, and back then, when there was the big open circuit in the West of the MLGs into the DreamHacks, into all these tournaments, ESWC, all the big names people remember from the old school, well, every one of them, back then, this was the joke of the esports industry. Everyone tried to pretend they were the world championship, that they were the biggest. So the problem is, if you got to have the marquee duo, otherwise you look like you're not the best one. So one thing I know also changed the industry was because you were able to have this leverage and make sure if you got hired, and by the way, I know how this works. When I did events, if it's an event you don't really want to do as much, you just charge them even more. You say for that one, look, unless I have a good reason, well, I can't say no to that much. So that's how it works. You can just do it like that. But the one I want to ask was this. I don't know how much you're aware of this. You must be from some friends that you have are commentators, but this has been basically, it had a ripple on the whole industry of esports, where not only did other figures themselves try to leverage more money and better rates and stuff, but crucially, I have known literally big tournament organisers. I won't say the names, I'll be kind to them. Just guess in your head, all the legendary ones, spoiler. I've known game devs that run their esports who have straight up told me, or indirectly I've heard through other figures, that they have even said the words, we don't want an Artosis and Tasteless scenario. We don't ever want it to be where they might have more leverage than us over this event, or we have to hire them, or they can't, like, they can dictate the bit. So as a result, I've known game devs where if they got, say, a CSGO major, or they had a big international tournament in League of Legends, and make it nice and vague here, they might intentionally try to only hire one of a famous duo, or hire them both, but then say maybe we'll mix and match who does the event in this way. And the whole premise was they never wanted it to get to the point where, like I say, you had to be hired for all these events and you had to be on the final because the event would want that, and so it put you in the ultra leverage position, right?
Yeah, no, I guess it really did. That's funny that they were specifically mentioning us about not wanting that to occur again. But yeah, we were in a great position, and it was an amazing time, no doubt.
Right, one quick question as well. This is the other little spicy one, like the Tasteless one before. Okay. In the same way as the Tasteless one, you're right, actually, that was even a thing publicly. People used to say all the time on Team Liquid and Reddit and all that. This is more of an industry one, but it ties into what I just said. So the industry perception was, because for a lot of other commentators, you were the Jason Lee figure. You were the mentors that they went to and they said, hey, like, I'm either working in Korea now or I want to be a top caster. How do I do with the rates stuff? It was implied by some people that Artosis was like, and Tasteless were like the godfathers. And it's like, you know, you must like approach them, you kiss the ring, godfather, yes. You know, you ask them for the favor, oh, can I help that? And so people tried to imply that like maybe you kept people like, they had to stay a little bit under you, or you in some way were told them, don't ask for that much because I'm going to ask for that much. I'm just putting this question to you. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's kind of crazy. It's almost like exactly opposite of how Nick and I conducted ourselves. And I mean, I really don't even know where that would come from, because we actually fought for this, especially, well, I would say primarily with other StarCraft casters, because that's really like the main thing we've done. We've casted a lot of games over the years, but like it's 90% StarCraft. But like that's something we've always told them is ask for more. Like you're not asking for enough. That was actually more the problem. Because if people are asking for like no money and we're asking for a lot of money, that actually hurts us.
That's true.
I want people to ask for a lot of money. So it's like, this is completely the opposite, I would say, as to what actually occurred over those years. And that's like an important thing, is that people do need to ask for more money. Like people that cast events for free and stuff is not good for the industry.
Yeah, I will corroborate as someone who's worked in broadcast myself. It's actually usually the other complaint that the top people have. We hate it when someone comes in and they just want to be at the event, so they will do it for half as much. Because then we're like, that's all my leverage you're giving away there. Because as you say, if it's like $200 a day extra for Artosis, now they might go, right, it's like a premium package. If I really want him, I get him. If it's like $700 more, they might just look at the budget and go, maybe I'll just take the hit, right? You're right. I think it flips the opposite way on that one. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, what about this then? When you actually got going in Korea, another element I wanted to ask about was this, is obviously you have for a long time been closely linked with IdrA, the infamous Terran player, and obviously Zerg player in StarCraft 2, but he'll always be a Terran player to me, right? And the problem with this topic is this, Artosis. I get the feeling that the perception in the West was that you're like the IdrA whisperer. You're the only one who can get through to this guy. Because everyone knows he could obviously be an explosive character. He was I would just say he had a lot of idiosyncrasies. I'll say one thing, even though he was quite rude to me, because spoiler, if you rubbed him the wrong way, he could be very rude to a lot of people. I will say over the years, I've sort of softened on what I thought of him. I used to think he was an arsehole back then. But what I realise now, Artosis, is things like this. First of all, from having like a big Twitter following and being more of a media figure myself, I know what it's like to feel like you're just endlessly being scrutinized and people are finding a million things where you just say, why do you care about that? But they have to, you're basically you become the topic of conversation and everything swirls around you. And if you do something wrong, it's not just you haven't done something wrong for 5 minutes. That's the topic of discussion for a week and people are pouring over it. And in his case, they'd be going back to the old things he said. And also, I will say back then, I think he was one of the first players I ever saw where he was almost like loved as much as he was hated. Like the people who loved him would be like, but why don't you win more? Which is like, that already sounds like a hater comment, guys. And then the haters were obviously just like, anytime he loses, like, you just fucking overrated, like, you shit, you don't know how to play, that Protoss was better. By the way, the ultimate insult's probably the last one. That's the joke I would throw in there. But basically, give me some thoughts on, now, all these years later, who was IdrA? Because, I mean, the way he exited StarCraft, sadly, that wasn't really the way he should have gone out. You know, it would have been cool if he'd gone out on top and it had been like a respectful sender. Like, he's someone in the West would be in a Hall of Fame in RTS, but I feel like the way he went out, like, people just remember the drama and they think he was never a good player or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's sad the way he went out, but like, I mean, I've known IdrA forever. Like, I used to run the best North American team and in Brood War called Micromedia, and he was actually brought to me when he was like not known, and you know, a mutual friend who was also on the team, Skew, brought him, and he's like, "This guy's really good. Let's play him some. Let's see." So I played him, and he just fit in perfectly with us. He was an angry Terran player, which is basically what we all were, right? Because Terran is such a pain in the ass in Brood War. But he just kind of fit in really well. And yeah, he had that kind of temper. This is something that like happens a lot. It's like a meme at this point about like playing Terran in StarCraft 1, because it's like if anything goes wrong at all, you lose. Anything, like you have to basically play flawlessly, and if you can do that, you can win championships, but it's like ridiculously hard to do. So he had this mentality that not a lot of people have. It's like the most unplayed race at this point in StarCraft, but you know, that's the type of mindset, right, that you kind of have as one of those players. You know, I'm known as a salty player, he was known as a salty player, and as you know, he worked really, really hard and became the best non-Korean Brood War player for a good chunk of time in there. And it's like he got so much shit when he would not win a tournament, right? Like in that TSL where Noni like made him cancel a command center. You accidentally misclick and cancel a command center and then like loses. It's like a free win immediately because the probe is harassing him. And it's like, that's the one mistake. He hit one button wrong, like one misclick, and he loses the game. And it's like, you know, people are talking so much shit, and his pro team is watching this happen, and it's causing a ton of stress in his life and everything. I mean, that's a lot to live up to, especially when you're playing a race that's so unforgiving. And then, you know, StarCraft 2 comes out, and he was going to play Protoss, and this may I don't know if this was a mistake or not, but
when you were the one who convinced him not to or something, right?
Yeah, I told him he needed to do Zerg, because here's the thing, like StarCraft 2 was blowing up, and Protoss just didn't have as much to do. And with IdrA's speed and multitasking ability, I was like, listen, Zerg has the most different things that you need to do at once. So you can you can leverage your skill in the greatest way if you go Zerg. And he looked at it and thought about it, was like, yeah, you're right. And he switched over to Zerg. And I think I think it did help him. Like, he always curses my name on that point, but I think it's like mostly a joke, because Zergs were so, it was like Terran in StarCraft 1 was Zerg at the beginning of StarCraft 2, where it's like it just wasn't a race you could win with. Everyone was having a really hard time with it. I mean, eventually it became the best, but in those early days, it was certainly considered really difficult to use. So, he's using that, once again, very frustrating race, losing games he shouldn't. He got so popular and so big at the beginning there that, and to watch, like you said, anytime anything goes wrong, everyone is all over him. Like, I remember there was this hilarious short period in the beginning of Wings of Liberty where, like, literally, if you beat IdrA like in an online cup or something, you'd get signed to a team immediately. This actually happened. I remember watching this and be like, I can't believe that this terrible guy that just all in IdrA just got signed to a team the next day. Like, that's insane. And then, of course, these guys would disappear because they actually are trash. It's just people are like, well, he beat IdrA, he must be really good. But yeah, when you're watching all of this happen and people are shit talking you because you're kind of an emotional, angry player, I think that he definitely was like kind of a villain of sorts, right? Where a lot of people like to have, are fans of people that like they aren't doing anything villainous. I don't know how to describe it exactly, right? But IdrA was very
I mean, they cheered against him, right? They wanted him to lose.
Yeah. Well, when he loses, it's more fun in a lot of ways because he actually will say something. True. Like a lot of people that are nice with, like, remember Liquid Hero? Like, he loses, he just kind of gets sad. And it's like, oh man, I like really feel, you can see the tears in his eyes. Like, he lost. He really means a lot to him. Well, it meant a lot to IdrA too. It's just he showed it in a different way. He showed it by flicking off MC or whatever, right? Like, that's, he showed that different type of emotion. And it's funny because like the dividing the scene like that into like haters and big time fans, that's like the most powerful thing you can do, I think. And that's something that is like really missing when you look at most esports nowadays, especially as esports get older and like you get more and more people that have just quietly grinded for 10 years that are pros now. You don't get these types of personalities anymore, but they are like the biggest things for the game. And like it's just IdrA cared, and he cared in a different way, and things frustrated him, and he let it all out. And I think that he made the whole pro scene a lot better because of that. But you know what? He eventually quit. It was kind of like this weird thing with some aggressive things that he typed, and things started to kind of go wrong. The thing is, he wasn't like as big a draw anymore. He wasn't at the top of every tournament anymore. So suddenly he's more expendable to his team, and all this garbage that exists within esports. And the thing is, he's much happier nowadays. He's living a good life, and so good on him. Like, I wish, he could have had one of these fairy tale endings where you like win one more tournament and then you go out on top or something. But I don't think that was ever going to be the way it was going to be for him. It's just that's not what his personality was. That's not what he brought to the scene. But what he brought to the scene, I think, is sorely missed.
And then I had a couple of players that we've definitely talked about in the past, but the best thing about this interview is StarCraft 2's lasted so long. You could be a hardcore modern-day StarCraft 2 player, and these are just like someone talking about like Pele and soccer or something. You won't have seen these guys play. So one player I want to talk about at the beginning is, I've noticed a trend in most esports games, which is early on when the mechanics aren't refined, Koreans haven't had a chance to get every build order down to the microsecond and know every opening and everything. At that point in the game, the skill that is obviously the most abundantly useful is to be super creative, to be the guy who can just intuitively do things. Your big brain, basically. It's not so much about hands, it's about the brain. That's why Boxer in the early days of StarCraft Brood War. So to me, the player I thought that exemplified that in the early days of StarCraft 2 was Nestea, because this is someone where once it did become about mechanics and he had to know, then he fell off, then he was just an okay player. But this guy in the early days, he was a genius, right?
Yeah, well, I sure thought so. Nestea was... Well, he was the oldest champion that we ever really got, right? Like, he won a championship when he was already 30 years old, which is like unheard of in Korea. Unheard of. Although we're probably going to enter that territory again really soon in StarCraft 2 as the players are coming back from military. But yeah, in that time, that was an insane thing to see. And the thing is, he was actually like really figuring out what to actually do with Zerg, because we had some early greatness from like Fruit Dealer with that first win. That was amazing. And like, he just kind of pulled that out of nowhere, and like IdrA was super strong in the early days and everything. But they really both kind of paled in comparison to what Nestea pulled off with 3 GSL victories. It took so many years for anyone to catch that with the Zerg race. But yeah, he was like, I think that his experience, and I've had this theory for a really long time now. He was actually delegated to play 2v2s on his team back in the day, right? So some of the weaker 1v1 players in StarCraft 1, there was a period of time where we had 2v2 as part of the Pro League match.
Yes.
And generally it would be like slightly weaker 1v1 players that they would force to be 2v2 players, which was really contentious because no one wanted to be a 2v2 player. Like, I remember I lived with the IdrA Pro team, and I remember watching players that were delegated to be 2v2 players and had to practice that all day and be ready for that, cry about it, like, and be like, this is terrible. Like, I don't want to do this. Like, this is not what I want for my career. But I feel like because like 2v2 is giving you so much information about the fundamentals of the game, it's like so many early units running into each other over and over and over, that it reminded me of this thing. Like, you're not supposed to talk about him, but Savior, the one Zerg Bonjour that we ever had, was a 2v2 player for a little bit as well. And he became the greatest Zerg that we had in Brood War, up to the point where, obviously he had that whole betting scandal and everything. But like, there's something there, I think, about spending that extra time on the very fundamental aspects that helped both of these players become the absolute best of their time periods. And yeah, I mean, Nestea was, I loved it, man. Like, he was taller than everyone, he was smarter than everyone, he was older than everyone, and he won more championships than everyone except like MVP in that era. So he was like a really special player. I thought he was the player I had the most fun casting, for sure.
And then obviously you just set the segue up perfectly. I obviously want to know about his teammate MVP, because this was the guy where if you were going to pick someone in the early days that was going to be the Bond, right, it was MVP. This guy, like, the joke was he could have even won more championships. Like, if people don't know the story, like, the two that are the crazy ones is obviously the one where he beat all the Protosses with the already busted in wrist. And then he almost did it again in the era of like the ridiculous Zerg OP in Wings of Liberty where he lost to life. Like, if people don't know, it took forever to get the G5L trophy for anyone else. Like, that took those other guys a million years to, they had like 10 years on this guy. He almost did it in like 2 years or something crazy. So this guy was, everyone knows Artosis loves MVP. Explain why. What was that MVP so good at?
Yeah, so MVP was, he was probably the actual strongest, like during the first switch from StarCraft 1 players to StarCraft 2, he was probably the actual strongest player that switched over. He wasn't super famous in StarCraft 1. He was coming up as a Terran. And the thing is, most of the people that switched into StarCraft 2 right at the beginning were the weaker players on the Kespa teams, because they saw that this was an opportunity. So MVP was probably the strongest guy that switched over at that time. But he just kind of outdid everyone. And in fact, like, okay, so StarCraft 2 came out, in 2010?
Yes.
Only about 2 years ago did his name exit the discussion of GOAT in StarCraft 2. So that's a pretty fucking wild, insane run. That's like, it just, man, it was literally until about 2 years ago, it was like, okay, MVP Maru Rogue Serral, who is it? And nowadays you can't really say MVP anymore, because it's like everyone just keeps playing and keeps winning championships. And it's like, okay, he's not really keeping up because he's not there. But yeah, he was just so legendary. He like figured out so much for Terran, outplayed everyone, won so many championships, so many tournaments like right in a row. And like you mentioned about his wrists, like his wrists gave out and he switched his style completely from the very micro and multitasking, it required like bionic play using a lot of like Marine Marauder medevac. He switched into playing mech all the time because it's slower and it didn't hurt his wrists as much, and he was still able to win. And so that's like, are you kidding me? He literally switched from like the thing he was best at and was winning for him, started winning with another style because his wrists hurt, and then eventually he just had to give up because he was in pain. It's too bad, because I mean, if he never got those wrist issues, he might actually still be like the GOAT.
Right. One thing I wanted to do in this interview was, we'll talk now a bit about like the middle period of StarCraft, but eventually I do want to make like a bunch of it about the last few years, which is probably the period that if everyone's like an old school fan tuning in, that's the part where you'll really get informed. So in the middle period, one of the players there's a couple of names I want to talk about, because some of them rose and had their years, but they're not the active top players now. So one of them was, because in themselves, somewhat mirroring StarCraft Brood War, the Protoss players in the GSL, they always struggle to have their bonjour, just like fucking Brood War. But I remember there was a couple of names came along, and there was two that could have done it. And you can argue maybe the second one did. But the one I always thought was going to be the best was obviously former T1 Rain. This guy he just looked like, if you wanted like the dream fucking Protoss player that could go head to head with all the macro Terrans, beat them up, you know, the dream of every Protoss player. Like, this was the guy. And then the other guy who actually did it in the tournaments was Zest, right? Tell me about these two players.
Yeah. So you're getting me excited here, Thorin. You really do your homework. So Rain came from StarCraft 1 during the Kespa switch. So the Kespa switch is when the teams officially entered StarCraft 2. The Kespa teams. This was kind of like from Blizzard and stuff. And at first they were doing both StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, which kind of like inhibited skill. But anyways, when they did eventually switch over, right, it was like not very long until we had a complete changing of the guard. Like, it took maybe a year, and then we had a GSL that had 31 Kespa players and one non-Kespa player qualify for it. So it's like, oh my God, that shows you that really the vast majority of talent had not switched. But when the switch was occurring, there were two players that were being talked about as like, these are going to be the guys from StarCraft 1 that dominate StarCraft 2. And that was Sulky and Rain.
There you go.
Which, by the way, both won GSL, then both went back to Brood War and won ASL. Like, or ASL and KSL for Sulky. But that's a crazy thing to me. That, like, that's how good these two are. But anyways, Rain, so Protoss was dictated almost completely by MC for the first years of StarCraft. Like, no one really knew like what style was going to emerge, and you kind of follow the top pros. But when MC came out and beat July Zerg in the GSL finals, I believe it was season 3 maybe of GSL. And July Zerg, of course, one of the most legendary players of all time. That was like a sick run of his. But MC demolished him with like very sentry-based force field-centric play that just dominated with like timing pushes, abusing the map, and just killing someone right off. So MC's highly aggressive Protoss style, because MC ended up winning 2 championships. He made it to the finals for that 3rd championship, which is kind of like the thing that sets you apart. In GSL is getting those 3, like MVP and Nestea, and then it was supposed to be MC, but he didn't quite do it. But he kind of got the entire race to go down this line of aggression, of attacking, of killing your opponent, of trying to trick them and things, right? Now, Rain went a completely different direction. He played the most passive, macro, defensive stuff that we had ever seen. So, like, he was bringing this completely different style. It looked like more of like a Terran-esque play from like StarCraft 1 that he was bringing in. And it was amazing. And like, he went ahead and like, he won without being on a Korean team. That was like the first time we ever had that happen in GSL. That's how strong he was at that point. Like, he quit the teams. He was on like My Insanity, if I'm recalling correctly. It took down GSL. Like, he just looked better than everyone in the whole world with this very, very, very different style that really only like one other Protoss has ever emulated, which is Stats, who had the most insane runs recently, where like Cyril beat him in the finals of every tournament for a year. But yeah, Rain really was something super special, and I think that was underlined extra when he went back to Brood War, because he went back to Brood War because it's like he could have won more championships. In fact, when he left, I remember like I was actually out having a beer with him after a tournament with a bunch of Afrika TV staff, and I was like, "Oh, you can't leave. Like, StarCraft 2 Protosses need you." Like, because he was the one showing how to play this. And I remember the guy that runs the whole league, Mr. Che, was like, "Hey, don't say that to him. Let him go. He wants to play Brood War." But he went to Brood War, and then immediately he's like the best Protoss in the world in Brood War. Like, whenever he plays, he got 2nd place the season before this season in ASL. He's won ASL before. It's insane. So like, this guy is like one of these unbelievable talents that is just going to win no matter what. So he was incredibly important for Protoss, I think, showing that style that Stats then carried on forward. And then your other question was Zest. Now, Zest is like, this guy, probably the best optimizer we've ever had in StarCraft 2, if you ask me. Like, so there's all sorts of different ways that you can play StarCraft. And like, you can play, like, for instance, Rain played a very reactive style, like a passive, macro reactive style, generally speaking. Obviously, everyone does a little bit of everything, but that's what he did. Whereas MC would he played like a shark, right? Like, he sniffs out blood in the water and he goes after it. Zest brought this completely different thing where he would like take builds and optimize the hell out of them, and like just be like, hey, I know how to get like 4 more zealots at this time or something like that, right? Where it's like suddenly you're playing against someone who just has more than what other people would have, or a tighter build, a quicker build than the other players. Zest actually like changed the metagame more times for Protoss than I think anyone ever did for any race. Like the amount of builds that he invented and showed and changed the metagame around is absolutely absurd. And he's another Protoss that won 2 GSLs and got to the finals multiple times and couldn't win that third one. And he is retired right now. He's going to be going to the military. So hopefully he'll come back and be able to do that eventually, but certainly one of the absolute best Protoss of all time. In fact, like I would say that he might be the most important Protoss since MC, honestly. Like just because like through all my years of casting, he invented more different things for Protoss than everyone else.
This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadju, Hades Good, Matt Pugnatio Racula, Adam Oaks, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Jensen Go, Kovacevic, Ord, Pacey, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Toucan, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask a question in one of those monthly AMAs where sometimes I roast people? Do you want teasers to find out who the guests are for upcoming shows and interviews I'm doing? Maybe you want to be part of one of those cool, lengthy esports discussions that I have. Well, if any of those perks sound tantalizing to you, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today, where? Via the Patreon link in the description box below.